In 1984, a woman named Carrie was admitted to a hospital in the American Midwest following a severe asthma attack that had caused her heart to stop. The medical team worked on her for a significant amount of time before she was declared dead. She was 28 years old. Her family was notified. The paperwork was begun. She was moved to the hospital morgue and placed in cold storage to await arrangements. The morgue attendant on duty that night was a man who had worked in that role for over a decade. He was experienced and careful, and he did not make mistakes in his documentation. He made one that night. He forgot to fully close the storage unit. This small error is the only reason Carrie is alive today. Sometime in the hours after she was placed in storage, the morgue attendant heard a sound from inside the unit. He assumed it was the mechanical sound of the cooling system cycling. He heard it again. He opened the unit. Carrie was conscious. She was hypothermic and deeply disoriented and in serious distress. But she was alive and she was breathing and she was looking directly at him when he opened the door. She was rushed back to the emergency department where the team who had declared her dead hours earlier worked to stabilize her. She survived. In the days that followed, as she recovered in the hospital, she told the staff something that none of them knew how to document in any official record. She told them she had been aware, not during the cardiac event itself, not during the resuscitation attempts, but afterward, in the period between being declared dead and waking in the cold of the storage unit, she had been aware of something. She described it differently in different tellings. Sometimes she called it a place, sometimes she called it a feeling, sometimes she simply said she had been somewhere else entirely, and that somewhere else had been more real to her than anything she had experienced before or since. She said she had not wanted to come back, not because she had been at peace, though she had been, but because whatever she had experienced in that time had made the ordinary world feel like a pale copy of something more vivid and more complete that existed just beyond the reach of living people. She went home 3 weeks after her admission. She lived for another 31 years. People who knew her in the years after her death and return described her as fundamentally changed in a way they found difficult to articulate. Not sadder, not more frightened, simply different. As though she was living in the ordinary world with the knowledge of another one just beneath the surface of it. She gave interviews occasionally over the years when asked. She never sensationalized what had happened to her. She spoke about it with a quiet matter-of-factness that most people who met her found more unsettling than any dramatic account would have been. She said she was not afraid of dying. She said this not as a comfort to herself, but simply as a statement of fact. The way you might say you are not afraid of returning to a place you have already been and found to be exactly as described. In 2008, staff at a hospital in Austria began noticing a series of small but persistent anomalies in one of the older sections of the building. Food going missing from the staff room refrigerator overnight, a persistent smell in one of the unused corridors that maintenance could not identify or locate. The sound of movement in a section of the building that was undergoing renovation and had been sealed off from the rest of the ward. Each of these things was individually explicable. Food going missing could be attributed to any number of people. Smells in old buildings were common and often impossible to trace. Sounds from a renovation area could come from any number of structural causes, but the anomalies continued. and they began to feel connected in a way that the staff found harder to dismiss over time. The section of the building where most of the disturbances seemed to originate was a corridor that had been partially closed off pending the renovation work. Access was restricted, the corridor was not in use. No staff had any reason to be in that section during overnight hours. A maintenance worker investigating the smell discovered a small gap in the wall of the closed corridor. Behind the gap was a space, not a crawl space, not a maintenance shaft, a space that had clearly been lived in. There was bedding in the space. There were food wrappers and containers. There were personal items. There were improvised arrangements that indicated someone had been living in that hidden section of the wall for a significant period of time. The investigation that followed revealed that a patient who had been discharged from the hospital some weeks earlier had never actually left the building. He had found a section of the old structure where the renovation work had created an accessible hidden space, and he had simply stayed. He was located and brought out without incident. He was not violent, he was not in a state of crisis in the way that might have been expected. When asked why he had stayed, he said something that the staff involved found difficult to forget. He said the hospital was the only place he had ever felt safe. He said he had not wanted to go back to the world outside. He said that inside the hospital walls he had felt watched over in a way he had never felt anywhere else, and that this feeling had been worth the cold and the dark and the fear of being found. He was referred for further care and eventually housed, but the staff who had worked in that building during the weeks he had been hidden in the walls could not entirely shake a particular thought. He had been there the whole time, moving quietly through the spaces between the rooms, listening to the sounds of the ward on the other side of the plaster, present in the building in a way that no one had known. And the building, in its old and imperfect way, had kept him. In 1963, in a small town in Greece, a young woman named Elena fell asleep. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that she did not wake up. Her family brought her to the local hospital where physicians examined her thoroughly and could find no cause for her condition. She was breathing. Her heart was beating. Her temperature was normal. She responded to no stimulation and showed no awareness of the world around her. She simply slept. Days passed, then weeks. The hospital had no explanation. The physicians who examined her used the language available to them at the time, which was limited, and documented her condition as an unexplained pathological sleep state. She was fed through a tube. She was turned regularly to prevent the complications of long-term immobility. She was cared for with the resources available in a small regional hospital in 1963, which were not extensive. Her family kept vigil. Weeks became months. The months accumulated into something that the physicians involved found increasingly difficult to document without the language failing them. They had no framework for what they were observing. They consulted colleagues. They wrote letters to hospitals in Athens and in other countries. They received responses ranging from sympathetic to dismissive. No one could explain it. No one could stop it. Eleanor slept for years. The world continued around her. Her family aged. The town changed. The hospital expanded. New staff arrived who had never known her before the sleep, and who had only ever known her as the woman in the long-term care room who had been there longer than most of the current staff. She became part of the fabric of the place. The staff who cared for her over the years described her in remarkably consistent terms, regardless of when they had worked with her. They said she looked peaceful, not the hollow peace of deep unconsciousness, something more like the peace of a person who is somewhere they would prefer to be. She also, many of them noted, appeared not to age in the way that might have been expected. This observation was made carefully and cautiously by people who were aware of how it sounded, but it was made consistently enough across different staff members and different years to be difficult to entirely dismiss. Elena woke up in 1978, 15 years after she had fallen asleep. She woke quietly and without drama. A nurse doing routine care found her sitting up in bed, looking at the window with clear and focused eyes. She was coherent. She was calm. She was physically weaker than a person her age would normally be, but not as compromised as the medical team had expected given the duration of her sleep. She asked for water. She asked what day it was. She was told the date. She absorbed this information with a stillness that the nurse present would describe for the rest of her career as the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed in a medical setting. Elena then asked about specific members of her family by name. Some of them were still alive, some of them were not. The physician who spoke with her in the days following her waking said she received both kinds of news with the same quiet equanimity, as though she had already been given some advance understanding of what she would find when she returned. She was asked repeatedly what she remembered of the 15 years. She gave different answers at different times. Sometimes she said she remembered nothing. Sometimes she said she remembered everything, but that the words for it did not exist in any language she spoke. Once, to a nurse she had grown particularly comfortable with, she said something that the nurse wrote down that evening and kept for the rest of her life. She said that the time had not felt long. She said it had felt like a brief pause between one moment and another. She said the difficult part had not been the sleeping. The difficult part, she said, was waking up and finding that while she had been paused, the world had kept moving, and that the distance that had opened up between her and everything she had known before was not something that could simply be closed by opening her eyes. She lived for another 22 years after waking. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to her. She never gave interviews. She never sought attention for what was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary medical events of the 20th century. She simply lived out her remaining years in the same quiet town where she had fallen asleep. And the people who knew her in those final decades said the same thing about her that the staff at the hospital had said during all the years of her sleep, that she seemed peaceful in a way that went deeper than circumstance, in a way that suggested she had been somewhere the rest of them had not been, and that wherever it was, it had not frightened her at all.